In the wake of the new war between Israel and Hamas, anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world. In Germany, sources are saying there are hardly any taboos left, while even in places like California, people are being killed. Today, I'm going to tell you where you can go to be safe and where attitudes are the most and the least anti-Semitic in the world. I've been really interested to see which countries have more or less anti-Semitic attitudes around the world in these last weeks. And so I looked at the Anti-Defamation League's index, which says 1.1 billion people have what they call anti-Semitic attitudes. And they basically put together an index on this. Now, you may agree with some of the questions, you may not, but they basically have a series of questions where they've done this demographic polling of people in countries all around the world and asked them questions that they deem to be anti-Semitic. Some of the questions include, are Jews more loyal to Israel than fill in the blank of this country? Jews have too much power in the business world or too much power over international financial markets. They still talk too much about the Holocaust, or they don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind, or have too much control over global affairs. Those are just a handful of the questions that the ADL's Global 100 asks people. And I'll be honest, a lot of the countries that we've talked about here over the years as interesting places to plant flags don't score as high. However, it's always worth checking these places out in person. One of the things that I think an index can't entirely capture, and my issue with a lot of these indices, is that when you actually go on the ground to some of these places, the average person doesn't really care. But we're going to go through some of the concerns and what people actually told the surveyors in each of the different countries, as well as tell you some of the least anti-Semitic places. I'll tell you from my own experience. One country that I spend time in is Malaysia. You can imagine Malaysia being a majority Muslim country with three main ethnic groups that make up Malaysian citizens. There are some areas where the scores were higher, and yet every single person I brought to Malaysia who thought because of some attribute of themselves wouldn't be as well liked there, they had no problems, and they were basically told to their face, like, we don't really care on a daily basis. Like, you do you, and we're just going to let you, do what you want. So I think that definitely checking places out in person is worth something. But obviously, there are a lot of people who are scared right now, living in Western countries where this resurgence in anti-Semitism has caused them, in some cases, to want to go somewhere else. I saw in Thailand, which historically has had pretty good relations with Israel, is my understanding, that a lot of people from Israel or of Jewish descent, I'm not sure how they would exactly know that, but it's reported, came to Thailand. And there is this increasing kind of anti-Muslim hate, they say, in Thailand. So according to the ADL's report, only 4% of people in Sweden are actually anti-Semitic. When they asked their questions, that was the number, 4%. And that was basically the lowest that it goes anywhere in the world, which is why I was interested when I read an article in Sweden where Swedish Jews don't feel safe since the Israel-Hamas war, with a quote, "We know where you live." You've seen throughout Europe people drawing swastikas and doing all sorts of things to homes of Jews and what have you. And so the article talks about how it's unclear whether Swedes are aware of what the country's Jewish community has been facing, but they've been in a state of anxiety. That is in allegedly the world's least anti-Semitic state of Sweden, where it is at 4%. And so obviously you can have issues anywhere. I think there's this idea that people think that there's someplace they're going to go is going to solve all their problems, and that's not what go where you're treated best means. We say go where you're treated best, and it means whether it's for the lowest taxes, whether it means for the most personal freedom, or whether it's just for your own safety, where most people are going to leave you alone. And so the study says Sweden is at 4%, even though there are some folks who feel uncomfortable there. The big question, because this is Nomad Capitalist talking about it, is, where do taxes play in? Obviously, people have this idea that all I care about or all we care about is taxes, and that's really not at all the case. Obviously, if you're looking for personal safety in very difficult times, paying some taxes is not going to be the issue. But do understand, if you're going to relocate to some of these countries, let's say you have a European passport, and there are plenty of people who have European passports, you can go and live in Sweden. You're going to have to pay taxes in Sweden. And so if I'm running an international business, is that something that I want to do? Or do I want to look at maybe an adjacent option that offers similar levels of safety where I can keep more of my own money? Because a lot of these countries, the Netherlands at 6%, Canada at 8%, these are some of the lowest, allegedly least anti-Semitic countries in the world. The USA, UK, and Denmark all tied for 10%. With the exception of the UK, if you're not British, if you're non-dom, these are high tax countries. And again, maybe that's not your top priority. And yet, What do you see in the U.S.? I mean, there was a guy in California who was literally killed in a protest. There are other stories coming from the U.S. I mean, people just don't feel as safe. That's the country that has 10%. Other countries, here's some from left field. Tanzania, 12%. Probably a little bit easier to immigrate to than the United States. Australia and New Zealand, two countries that are often talked about in terms of escaping, a world war or some nuclear event. 14%. Those are tied. Very expensive places to get into if you're trying to get an investor residence permit. Ghana surprised me at 15%. I would imagine a lot of people are not going to immigrate to Ghana. But here are some that intrigue me. At 16%, you have Nigeria and Uganda. Again, very interesting. Some of the lowest rates of anti-Semitism apparently in the world in those countries. But also Singapore and Iceland. Singapore, if you start a business there, you can get a residence permit. Maybe not as easy if you're a whole family. There's certainly very expensive ways to invest and get residence there. We've talked about that. Prices on that has gone way up. But Singapore, people just kind of leave you be. I love that part of the world. I love Southeast Asia. I have a home in Malaysia. People just leave you be. Iceland, interesting. If you are a European passport holder, you can live there. And so if I have descent, if I have, parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who are from some country in Europe, if you can get that passport, I would. You don't have to live in Poland, for example. You could use that European Union member country passport, and you could go and live in Sweden if you wanted to, or the Netherlands, where they say it's some of the lowest rates. Or you could even go to Iceland, which is not in the EU, but you have that ability to live there. Also in the EU, Italy scored relatively well, 18%. So that's about double what the US is, but 18% in the grand scheme of things wasn't really that high. Another interesting country, Jamaica. I'm not sure people are rushing to go to live in Jamaica, but what's interesting is you have a Caribbean passport. The Caribbean community, of which all the 5 Caribbean Citizenship by Investment Program states are members of, they're actually opening up a bit more flexibility for people to move between the Caribbean community countries, as opposed to just what they have now, the Eastern Caribbean states with more loose rules for skilled workers to go within the Caribbean community. So not a bad idea. Another reason to have a Caribbean passport. You can get one in a matter of months. You can donate $100,000 and up plus fees, and you'll have access to some of these countries like Jamaica to some extent. Austria and Ireland came in at 20%. Ireland actually like the most pro-Palestine country, but I think also a very welcoming people that just you're who you are. It's a pretty laid-back place, but certainly geopolitically not in favor of the state of Israel if it's between that and Palestine. But Austria and Ireland, 20% came in among the lower ones. Portugal at 21%. And then in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil, 24 and 25% respectively. Latin America is great because you can get residence permits there affordably. So Mexico, you just show you have income. Brazil has some investment, visa. If you're going to give birth to a child, you can do that in Mexico or Brazil, and you can speed up the process to citizenship and be able to be there. But I mean, there's certainly very large, Jewish communities in places like, Mexico and Mexico City, Brazil, I think as well. And so those are some of the least anti-Semitic places in the world. Some of the countries that we've talked about, for example, Armenia scored pretty poorly. Some of the places in Asia, Eastern Europe actually scored relatively poorly. So for example, like Ukraine, they were at 29%, and that was one of the, the lower ones. Bulgaria came in at 44%. So those are the places, if I have an EU member passport, I'm probably not rushing to go there. We've talked about Montenegro. They're actually not that much higher at 29%, but you go next to Bosnia, it's 32%. Croatia, it's 33%. So obviously some of these places in Western Europe, the U.S., Canada, are more open, and even there, some people aren't safe. And so what I think is interesting is looking at the places that you don't often think about. Whatever your concern is, whether it's this or any other concern, I would probably put more stock for a lot of personal concerns in saying, I'm going to move to a place in Asia where it's a bit more live and let live. I'm going to perhaps live in a place like Mexico or some other Latin American country where there's just a country of immigrants, and there's more of that just kind of melting pot nature built into the immigration code that's just so much easier to immigrate to those countries. And if I can get my hands on a European passport, I can certainly donate close to $1 million to Malta and have that option to live in any of the European countries. If I have descent, I can claim that. We help people do that at Nomad Capitalist. It's interesting which countries not only rank the best, but also that some of those countries still have problems. Not that every place is going to be perfect, but that you probably want a couple different options, whatever you're concerned about. And so that's something we help people do at Nomad Capitalist. But very interesting to see what's happening as the situation between Israel and Hamas unfolds.